Picture a child standing in snow. She is maybe 8 9 years old, small enough that the world still feels enormous around her. The year is somewhere in the early 1990s, and the Oregon winter has turned everything outside into a smear of grey and white. A car pulls up to her house. A man gets out. He doesn't look like a man, exactly. He looks like something wearing a man, like someone stitched together a human being from scratch and got almost everything right except the feel of it. He walks toward her. He doesn't speak. He just looks. And then, that's it. That's all you get for now. The film cuts away. In that opening minute, Longlegs tells you everything you need to know about what it's going to be. Not a horror movie that leans on jump scares. Not a thriller that lives and dies on plot twists. Something older, stranger, and considerably more unsettling than either of those things. A film that communicates in the language of wrongness, where something is off in every single frame, but you can't immediately put your finger on what. It operates like a half remembered nightmare, one of those dreams that doesn't make logical sense but leaves you feeling genuinely shaken when you wake up. When Longlegs hit theaters on July 12, 2024, it arrived on the back of one of the most effective horror marketing campaigns in recent memory. And then something unusual happened. It actually delivered. Not in the way some viewers expected, not in the clean genre way that the trailers maybe implied, but in a stranger, more atmospheric way that divided audiences right down the middle and launched 1,000 internet debates. Critics largely loved it. General audiences had feelings, and somehow a horror film made for under 10 million ended up grossing 128 million worldwide, becoming the highest grossing indie horror film in North American history. Unseating A2's Talk to Me from a throne it had barely finished warming. So what exactly is Longlegs? Where did it come from? Why did it work the way it worked? And what does it say about horror in 2004, both as a piece of craft and as a cultural event? That's what we are going to dig into today, scene by scene, frame by frame, all the way down. Buckle up. The man behind the horror, Osgood Perkins. You can't talk about Longlegs without talking about Osgood Perkins, because this film is deeply personal in ways that go far beyond a director leaving their stylistic fingerprints on a project. Perkins isn't just a filmmaker who makes horror movies. He's someone who grew up swimming in the deep end of American horror mythology, and that background shapes everything about how he makes films. His father was Anthony Perkins, Norman Bates, the single most iconic performance in the history of psycho killer cinema. Osgood Perkins was 5 years old when Psycho came out. Wait, that's not right. Anthony Perkins starred in Psycho in 1960. Oz was born in 1974, so he grew up with a father who was forever tied to one of film's defining monsters, who spent decades navigating the strange reality of being beloved for playing a murderer. Anthony Perkins died of AIDS-related pneumonia in 1992. When Oz was 18 years old, the loss was immense and the creative shadow long. It would be easy to psychoanalyze Osgood Perkins' entire filmography through that single lens: dead father, horror legacy, unresolved grief. And there's a version of that reading that's genuinely illuminating when it comes to Longlegs. But it also risks reducing a genuinely singular filmmaker to a pop psychology case study. What's more interesting is tracking what Perkins actually built over years of work before this film. He spent time as an actor first, small roles, supporting parts. You might recognize him from The Avengers 2012 or Oz the Great and Powerful 2013. He was good, but performing wasn't where his real appetite lived. Behind the camera, he found his actual voice. The Blackcoat's Daughter, his feature directorial debut, arrived in 2015 and announced him as someone worth paying serious attention to. Shot at a boarding school in the dead of winter with a slow burn dread that most first-time directors couldn't sustain for 20 minutes, let alone 90. It told a horror story about grief, possession, and maternal loss in a way that was almost hypnotic in its patience. It wasn't widely seen on initial release, but it developed a devoted following, the kind of film that spreads through word of mouth among horror people who trust each other. I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House followed in 2016, a Netflix film so deliberately slow and literary that it read more like a prose poem about death than a conventional haunted house story. It divided audiences even more sharply than his debut. Gretel and Hansel in 2020 leaned slightly more accessible while maintaining his atmospheric sensibility, reshaping the fairy tale into something genuinely sinister and visually distinctive. By the time Longlegs was greenlit, Perkins had built a body of work that was coherent and author-stamped, but had never broken through to mainstream audiences. He was a cult filmmaker, respected in the horror community, largely unknown outside it. Longlegs changed all of that. The making of the film production on Longlegs took place in and around Vancouver, British Columbia, a shooting location that stood in for the grey, overcast Pacific Northwest aesthetic the film required. Director of photography Andres Arochi collaborated closely with Perkins to establish a visual language built on deliberate wrongness, compositions that are slightly off balance, lenses that distort in subtle ways, a color palette that's been drained of warmth until the world looks like it's been bleached from the inside out. Production designer Danny Vermette built out the film's 1990s world with careful attention to the specific texture of that decade rather than just its surface signifiers. This wasn't Stranger Things style nostalgic set dressing, the kind of production design that essentially amounts to a greatest hits parade of decade specific props. Vermette and his team were going for something more specific, the particular flatness of middle American domestic space in the early 90s, the institutional beige of FBI offices, the strange intimacy of houses where terrible things have happened. The homes in this film feel worn in a way that takes genuine craft to achieve. The budget was a point of genuine mystery for a while. Neon confirmed it was under 10 million. Some industry sources put the actual production cost closer to 3 million, with the remaining spend going toward marketing and distribution. Whatever the exact figure, the financial reality shaped certain creative choices. There are no elaborate set pieces here, no sequences that required expensive technical infrastructure. What the budget forced was a reliance on atmosphere, performance, and camera work to generate tension, which turned out to be exactly the right constraint for this particular story. Nicolas Cage's involvement deserves special mention in the production context. Cage in 2004 was riding a genuine career renaissance. His performance in Pig 2025 had reminded the broader cinematic conversation that beneath the memeified version of him that had calcified in the popular imagination was a genuinely gifted, deeply committed actor. Longlegs gave him a chance to lean all the way into the unhinged end of his range, and the conditions Perkins set up for his performance were unusual. Cage spent significant preparation time on the character's physicality and vocal choices, reportedly developing a distinctive voice for Longlegs that emerged partly from his research into certain real-world individuals and partly from his own instincts about what would make the character feel genuinely alien. Maika Monroe, meanwhile, had been building a genre career since her breakout in It Follows 2004, one of the defining American horror films of the 2010s. A decade later, she was stepping into a significantly more complex character role. Lee Harker isn't the archetypal horror protagonist, and navigating the character's specific emotional flatness without tipping into blandness required more subtlety than it might initially appear. More on that when we get to the performance analysis. The marketing machine. Before a single frame of Longlegs played in a theater, the campaign surrounding it had already become a story in its own right. Neon's marketing strategy was built around controlled information scarcity and genuine mystery creation. The early teasers gave audiences almost nothing. Glimpses of Nicolas Cage in a state of extreme physical transformation, voice clips of unnerving dialogue, imagery that suggested occult subject matter without explaining its context. The studio leaned hard into the comparison to The Silence of the Lambs, and while that comparison turned out to be partially misleading, the films operate very differently. It served its purpose in generating anticipatory excitement among audiences who loved that film's particular blend of procedural thriller and psychological horror. The piece de resistance was the ARG, the alternate reality game built around a website called The Birthday Murders. The site used a deliberately retro 1990s aesthetic, slow-loading pages, cryptic puzzles, information about the film's fictional murders scattered across it like evidence. Horror fans tore through it. Gaming communities got involved. The puzzle elements created genuine community engagement that turned the film's pre-release period into a participatory event rather than a passive marketing experience. By the time Longlegs actually opened, the anticipation was at a fever pitch. Opening weekend delivered 2.6 million, a record for Neon, the independent studio that had been building a reputation as the cool alternative to A24's dominance in the specialty film market. The word of mouth was complicated. Critics loved it, audiences were more mixed, and within days, the conversation about the film had split into parallel debates about what it was actually trying to do and whether it succeeded. The discourse was alive in a way that most films, horror or otherwise, never achieve. That tension between what the marketing promised and what the film actually delivered is itself worth examining. Because Longlegs absolutely delivers on atmosphere and dread. It's one of the most genuinely unsettling films of 2024, but it delivers those things through a register that some viewers found disorienting rather than satisfying, through choices that prioritize feeling over explanation and mood over conventional thriller mechanics. Whether that's a strength or a weakness depends entirely on what you're looking for from a horror film. And exploring that question honestly is one of the things this video is going to do. What kind of film is this exactly? Genre-wise, Longlegs sits at the intersection of several different traditions. It's a serial killer procedural, FBI agent hunting monster, which places it in the lineage of The Silence of the Lambs, Zodiac, Mindhunter. It's a supernatural horror film with genuine occult elements that the narrative takes seriously rather than treating as metaphor or window dressing. It's a psychological portrait of a deeply unusual protagonist navigating a world she doesn't entirely belong to. And it's, in some ways, a grief film carrying a thematic weight about parental legacy, inherited trauma, and the particular horror of discovering that the people who shaped you were capable of monstrous things. Perkins has spoken in interviews about his influences here, and the list illuminates what he was reaching for. The Silence of the Lambs for obvious reasons. The dynamic between investigator and killer, the procedural structure, the sense that catching the monster will cause something irreplaceable. Seven for its willingness to let the villain triumph, its refusal of clean resolution, its understanding that evil doesn't always get defeated so much as it concludes on its own terms. There are traces of early 90s horror more broadly, the specific texture of films like The Believers or early Wes Craven work, where occult material was treated with genuine menace rather than genre familiarity. But Perkins wasn't trying to replicate any of these. The goal was to synthesize them into something personal, to make a film that felt like those influences without looking like imitation. Whether you think he fully achieved that synthesis probably depends on where you land on the film's more idiosyncratic choices, which we'll get into throughout this analysis. For now, just hold this thought. Longlegs is a film that knows exactly what it's doing, even when, especially when, what it's doing seems strange. Every weird choice is a deliberate weird choice. Every moment that doesn't add up in conventional thriller terms adds up in the film's own particular grammar. Learning to read that grammar is what this video is all about. S3 analysis. ACT1, the wrong shape of things. There's a specific kind of unease that Longlegs builds in its opening act that I want to be precise about because it's different from how most horror films establish dread. The typical approach is contrast show us something normal, then contaminate it. Give the audience a baseline of safety and then violate it. Longlegs doesn't do that. From its very first image, the film presents a world where normal never existed. There is no safety baseline to violate. The wrongness is baked in from the start, and your job as a viewer is to figure out what, specifically, is wrong. That's a much harder creative challenge to pull off, and Osgood Perkins pulls it off. The opening image and what it communicates. The film begins with a date card 1974, then a road, Oregon. Winter. The aspect ratio is narrowed. Perkins and his DP Andres Arochi shoot certain memory sequences in a compressed format that creates a subtle sense of claustrophobia, as if the frame itself is holding something in. It's not an aggressive stylistic choice, it's quiet. Most viewers won't consciously register it, but they'll feel it. A sense that what they're looking at is somehow smaller than it should be, more confined, less open than the snowy landscape seems to promise. We are with a young girl. She's walking home along a country road, backpack on, unremarkable in every external way. The camera keeps a specific distance from her, not too close, not too far, a mid-range that refuses the intimacy of a close-up and the detachment of a wide establishing shot. We are watching her the way you'd watch something you weren't sure you should be watching. Observational, waiting, a car slows, stops, a figure emerges. And here's where the film does something genuinely impressive. What you expect in the glamour of horror film openings is a clear shot of the monster, the reveal, the face. Longlegs withholds it. You get impressions, unusual height, wrong proportions, something off about the way the figure moves, but not clarity. The camera doesn't give you what you want, which is information. It gives you instead what the girl would feel incomprehension. Something's wrong, but you can't name it. Your brain keeps reaching for a recognizable shape and coming up empty. The interaction is brief and wordless. The figure simply looks at her. She looks back. The film cuts. That's it. Scene over. We jump forward 20 years. The choice to withhold Longlegs' face here is crucial and is worth pausing on. Most serial killer films introduce their monster with at least enough visual information to establish the threat. The Silence of the Lambs puts Hannibal Lecter in a glass cage and lets you see him clearly. The danger there is psychological, established through conversation and stillness, but the face is never hidden. Severin keeps John Doe off screen for most of the runtime, but his work is constantly visible. Longlegs hides its killer in plain sight from the jump, which does two things simultaneously. It creates genuine unease by refusing visual resolution, and it retroactively makes the opening even more disturbing once you understand later exactly what that roadside interaction was. We'll come back to that. Meet Lee Harker. The film's next substantial sequence introduces us to its protagonist through a scene that functions as a very efficient character diagnostic. FBI trainee Lee Harker, played by Maika Monroe, is at a house. A man inside is wanted. Her colleagues are waiting for tactical support. Harker doesn't wait. She walks up to the house, points at a specific door without being told anything, and says flatly, with no particular affect, "He's behind that one. He is." This scene does a lot of work quickly. It tells us Harker has some form of intuitive or psychic ability, not dramatized here through gasps or visions, just presented as fact the way you'd present any other skill. It tells us she's impulsive, or perhaps more accurately, that she operates according to her own internal logic, regardless of what the situation's conventional protocols require. And it tells us that her colleagues find her unsettling, that the admiration they might feel for the result is undercut by discomfort about the process. She knows things she shouldn't know. That's useful, and it's also deeply weird. Monroe plays this introduction with a carefully calibrated blankness that I suspect frustrated some viewers and intrigued others. Harker isn't warm. She doesn't have that approachable, likable protagonist energy that most Hollywood lead characters carry as a default setting. She's not cold either, exactly. She's not the Ice Queen genius type, the brilliant but difficult detective archetype. She's something more specific and harder to categorize. A person who's slightly disconnected from the social textures everyone around her navigates naturally. She participates in conversations without quite being in them. She completes tasks with competence while existing in a private elsewhere. What this communicates, before we know any of the story specifics, is that Lee Harker and Normal do not comfortably coexist. The film is going to spend a lot of time exploring why. The case file, Longlegs, and the birthday murders. Harker's unusual ability gets her assigned to a cold case that the FBI has been unable to crack for decades. Agent Carter, her superior played by Blair Underwood, with a weary, frustrated intelligence that drowns a lot of the film's more outlandish elements, brings her in to look at what the Bureau has started calling the birthday murders. The pattern is this: families in Oregon have been turning up dead. Each time, the father has killed the rest of his family and then himself. No history of violence, no apparent motive, no signs of outside intrusion. The crime scenes are clean in the worst possible way. There's nothing for investigators to hold on to. The only connecting thread is a note found at each scene. Handwritten. Cryptic. Signed with an occult symbol that's been identified as relating to satanic iconography, and the murders always occur around a family member's birthday. The notes themselves are one of the film's most quietly disturbing elements, and they are worth discussing in some detail here, because they don't read the way you'd expect a serial killer's communication to read. They are not taunting. They are not addressed to investigators. In fact, there is no direct communication to law enforcement in the conventional sense. They read more like internal correspondence. like someone recording something for reasons that have nothing to do with being caught or not caught, for reasons that exist entirely within a private cosmology that has its own logic, its own priorities, its own sense of audience. The cipher quality of the notes, their encoded layered language functions in the film as a kind of textual horror. The actual content of what Longlegs writes is disturbing, but equally disturbing is the form, the handwriting that sprawls and loops with an organic, almost childlike intensity, the way the pages are dense with meaning that rewards close reading but also resists straightforward interpretation. Perkins understood that reading the killer's words should feel like an invasion, like touching something that was never meant to be touched. The notes succeed at that. Harker starts working the case, and the film enters its detective procedural phase, which is where the Silence of the Lambs comparisons the marketing leaned on are most literally applicable, and also where they begin to diverge. Procedural dread, how the investigation unfolds. The investigation sequences in Longlegs are distinctive for what they don't do. A conventional serial killer procedural builds its tension through accumulating information clues. Compound. The picture gets clearer. The investigator gets closer to understanding. There's a forward momentum to that structure, a sense of intellectual progress that generates its own engagement, even independent of visceral horror. Longlegs inverts this. The more Harker investigates, the less clear things become. Information doesn't resolve into understanding. It resolves into deeper mystery, into the growing sense that the case operates according to a logic she is not equipped to process through normal investigative channels. The FBI's rational empirical framework, which is supposed to be the tool that unlocks criminal behavior, keeps bouncing off the surface of what Longlegs is actually doing. The bureaucratic machinery of law enforcement is shown to be genuinely useless here, not through any failure of individual competence, but because the thing they are dealing with doesn't play by the rules that machinery was designed to handle. This is smart genre work. The FBI procedural aesthetic creates an expectation of eventual rational explanation, of a mystery that will, at the end, be decoded and contained. By using that aesthetic while simultaneously undermining it, Perkins puts the viewer in the same position as his protagonist, working from familiar tools toward an unfamiliar problem, accumulating information that keeps destabilizing rather than stabilizing the picture. Harker's intuitive ability becomes more obviously central here. She keeps knowing things, pointing toward right answers, making connections that aren't visible through conventional evidence, in a way that her colleagues notice and discuss. Carter is pragmatic about it. He doesn't care whether her intuitions are psychic gifts or pattern recognition, so sophisticated it operates below conscious articulation. They work, and in a case this code, anything that works is valuable. Other colleagues are less comfortable. There's a scene in the early investigation, Harker alone with case files, photographs spread across a table, where Monroe communicates something very specific with her physicality. She's not reading these documents the way a detective reads evidence. She's reading them the way someone reads a message that was meant for them specifically. There's recognition in her reaction, or something like recognition, a resonance rather than discovery. The film is planting seeds here that won't fully germinate until the third act, but they're planted with delicacy, in moments that feel character specific rather than expository. The first real look at Longlegs. The film's actual introduction of Nicolas Cage's Longlegs is one of the more extraordinary sequences in recent American horror cinema, and I want to give it the space it deserves. By the time Longlegs actually appears on screen in a sustained way, not the roadside glimpse from the cold open, but a fully realized scene, the film has spent considerable time building up a specific idea of who or what this person is. The notes, the crime scenes, the photographs, the case history stretching back through decades. Your imagination, prompted by the film's careful withholding, has been constructing something. Cage obliterates your construction immediately. Longlegs is tall, pale to the point of translucency, dressed in the specific fashion of someone who has assembled themselves according to principles that have nothing to do with contemporary norms or any other norms. His hair is enormous, bleached, perched on his head with a quality that's somewhere between deliberate affectation and total indifference to how it looks. His face, and the prosthetic and makeup work here is extraordinary, is distorted in ways that are subtle enough to be deeply wrong rather than cartoonishly monstrous. The nose, the cheekbones, the particular way his mouth sits. He looks like someone drew a face from memory without having seen one in a while. But all of that is detail, context. The thing that makes the Longlegs introduction genuinely terrifying is Cage's voice. It's high pitched, fluting, almost childlike, and then it drops suddenly into registers that feel physically wrong coming from a human throat. It doesn't perform menace in any conventional way. It's not a movie villain voice. It doesn't imply suppressed violence or controlled danger. It implies something further out than that, something that has moved beyond the recognizable spectrum of human motivation into a private space where ordinary evaluations of threat don't apply. Listening to Cage's Longlegs speak is disorienting in the way that encountering genuinely deranged speech in real life is disorienting. You keep reaching for a way to parse what you're hearing, and your frameworks keep coming up short. Perkins has talked about how he and Cage deliberately avoided grounding the character in the psychological realism that most thriller villains get. No backstory delivered through dialogue, no carefully planted humanizing detail that makes the monster relatable or understandable. Longlegs exist in the film the way a symbol exists, not as a person with a fully rendered interior life, but as a force, a manifestation of something larger. Making a character feel that way while keeping him physically embodied, while keeping him anchored in the actual events of an actual plot rather than drifting into pure abstraction, is genuinely difficult. Cage makes it work through sheer committed weirdness. The specific scene details we'll get into further in the Act 2 analysis, when the investigation properly converges on Longlegs. For now, the point is this: the Act 1 introduction of the case, the investigator, and the shadow of the killer achieves exactly what a first act needs to achieve. It establishes stakes, it creates investment, it generates questions, specific, productive questions that the viewer genuinely wants answered. And it does all of this while maintaining that core, distinctive quality, the sense that normal never existed here, and that whatever resolution this story reaches, it won't be the kind that restores any version of it. Harker's home life, the isolation detail. One element of the first act that repays attention is the sparse treatment of Harker's life outside the investigation. This is deliberate negative space. The film shows us almost nothing of a personal life. No romantic entanglement, no close friendships, no domestic routines beyond the barest minimum. Her apartment is functional and impersonal. Her interactions with colleagues are professional and brief. This could read as a failure of characterization, the lead character defined entirely by her job, her interiority left unexplored. But it's not that, and the evidence that it's not that is in how the emptiness is framed. It's framed with the same quiet precision as everything else in this film, as information, as something that means something. Harker doesn't have a life outside this case, not because Perkins forgot to give her one, but because the case, it turns out, is her life. Has been in ways she doesn't fully understand yet, since she was a child on a snow covered road. The isolation detail also does practical work. It focuses the viewer's attention entirely on the investigation and on Harker's relationship to it, eliminating the narrative static of subplots and secondary relationships. This is a film that trusts its central thread. It doesn't hedge against the possibility that the main story isn't engaging enough by filling the margins with distractions. It commits completely to the one story it's telling, which is either confidence or recklessness depending on your tolerance for that kind of formal austerity. Given the result, I'd call it confidence. Act 2 of Longlegs is where the film's architecture becomes most visible and most interesting. It's also where the gap between what some viewers expected and what the film was actually doing started to widen. The procedural momentum of the first act, the promise of an investigation moving toward resolution, gets quietly complicated here. Not abandoned. The investigation continues, evidence accumulates, Harker gets closer to her target, but the quality of that progress shifts. It stops feeling like detectives catching a criminal and starts feeling like a person walking towards something they don't yet know they were always walking toward. That's a meaningful distinction, and unpacking it is where this section of the analysis lives. The cipher, reading the unreadable. One of the film's most genuinely tense sequences involves Harker working through the coded language of Longlegs' letters. We've established that the notes are cryptic, that they read like internal correspondence rather than communication. Now, in the second act, the film gives Harker and us a more sustained engagement with the actual content. What emerges from that engagement is unsettling for reasons that go beyond conventional thriller mechanics. The notes aren't taunts, and they aren't confessions, and they aren't the organized, internally consistent logic of a delusional system. There's something stranger. They read like transcription, like someone writing down instructions they've received rather than composed. The voice in the letters isn't self generated in the way you'd expect from a serial killer's communication. It has the quality of dictation, of a medium channeling rather than an author creating. This is the film's first substantial hint at the theological dimension underlying the surface narrative. Longlegs, we are beginning to understand, doesn't think of himself as a murderer. He doesn't think of himself as a criminal, a predator, or even an agent with independent will in the way those terms imply. He thinks of himself as an instrument, something is moving through him, and the letters document that movement with the earnest fidelity of a recording device. The cipher work also gives Monroe one of her strongest early scenes, Harker alone, with paper and pen, working through decryption with the focused intensity of someone who senses that this isn't just information they're after, that what's encoded here has something to do with them specifically. The camera stays close on her face and hands. It watches her the way she watches the letters, with patient, slightly unnerving attention. The scene's tension isn't generated by music or editing or any of the conventional apparatus of thriller suspense. It comes from the quality of Monroe's concentration, from the sense that she's reading something and something is reading her back. Agent Carter and the institutional friction. Blair Underwood's Agent Carter deserves more discussion than he tends to get in analysis of this film. The tendency is to focus on the two-star performances, Monroe's flat intensity and Cage's operatic strangeness, and treat Carter as connective tissue, the functional superior who moves Harker through the plot. That reading undersells what Underwood is actually doing. Carter is, in some respects, the film's most tragic figure. He is a competent, intelligent, seasoned investigator who has spent years working a case that resists every tool he has. He is not incompetent, he is not corrupt. He is not the obstinate bureaucrat archetype who dismisses the unconventional protagonist's insights out of institutional rigidity. He takes Harker seriously. He uses her abilities pragmatically. He wants to solve this case with a genuine urgency that Underwood keeps visible beneath the character's professional composure. But Carter operates in the empirical world. His framework is evidence, procedure, prosecutable fact. And the Longlegs case doesn't live in that world. Not entirely, maybe not at all. The tragedy of Carter is that his competence is irrelevant here, not because he's in the wrong job, but because the job, in this case, is the wrong tool. He can't know that. He keeps working the case, the way you work a case, bringing professionalism and intelligence and genuine commitment to an investigation that those qualities can't resolve. There's something quietly devastating about watching a capable person work hard in entirely the wrong direction, and Underwood carries that quality in every scene. His relationship with Harker is also more nuanced than the standard mentor unconventional protege dynamic the film's genre category might lead you to expect. Carter isn't guiding her. He's watching her with the slightly wary respect of someone who understands they're in the presence of an ability they don't have access to and can't fully evaluate. He gives her room, not out of confidence in where she's going, but out of a realistic assessment that where he's been hasn't worked. There's a generosity to that, a pragmatic humility that Underwood makes genuinely moving. The investigation deepens, crime scene texture. The second act gives us sustained looks at the crime scenes in ways that are more analytical than the first act's brief introductory glimpses, and this is where Perkins's visual decision making really starts to reveal itself. The Longlegs crime scenes are characterized by a quality that's unusual in serial killer cinema. They look domestic. Not pristine, not staged with the theatrical flair that fictional serial killers often favor, not arranged to communicate anything to investigators or to demonstrate power over victims. They looked like interrupted ordinary life. Kitchens where meals were being prepared, living rooms with the TV still on, a child's bedroom with homework spread across a desk. The violence that happened in these spaces didn't transform them into something monstrous looking. The horror is in the normalcy that violence left untouched. This is a precise piece of visual design that communicates something specific about what Longlegs is and isn't. He didn't come to these homes to perform. He came because something required him to. The families weren't chosen for theatrical reasons. The murders weren't exhibitions. They were, from within Longlegs' cosmology, acts of service. The dolls are part of this picture, and they're among the film's most distinctive visual elements. Handmade, human sized figures found at each crime scene, constructed with obvious effort and skill, dressed and positioned with care. They are not trophies and they are not warnings. They seem to be gifts, offerings, things left behind by someone who wanted the families to have something. The wrongness of them isn't in violent imagery, it's in the tenderness they imply. Someone made these with love. That someone committed mass murder in the same house. The gap between those two facts is where a great deal of the film's horror lives. Orochi's camera doesn't linger on the dolls in horror film fashion. No dramatic slow push in, no sting on the soundtrack to cue your reaction. They are simply present in the frame, part of the scene's inventory, observed with the same attention the film gives everything else. This restraint is actually more effective than emphasis would be. The dolls don't announce themselves as horrifying. They wait for you to fully register what they imply. Harker meets Longlegs, the interview scene. This is the sequence the whole first act has been building toward, and Perkins doesn't dissipate the anticipation. He meets it and then exceeds it. Harker is face to face with Longlegs in a law enforcement context. He's in custody. She's the investigator. The conventional template for this scene, derived directly from the Lecter-Clarice dynamic that remains the genre's foundational example, is a battle of wits. The imprisoned monster probes the investigator's psychology, seeking vulnerability. The investigator probes for information, seeking the key that unlocks the case. Advantage and disadvantage shift. The monster is contained but dangerous. Tension comes from the interplay. Longlegs respects that template enough to use its physical architecture. The separation, the controlled environment, the face-to-face encounter, and then completely abandons its psychological mechanics. Longlegs doesn't probe Harker. He doesn't perform intelligence or demonstrate control or attempt to establish dominance in the ways the genre has taught us to expect. He is not interested in her the way Lecter is interested in Clarice. Not as a puzzle, not as a challenge, not as an audience for his sophistication. His interest in her is something else, something that operates outside the glamour of predator and potential, victim or criminal, and investigator. He looks at her with a quality that's closer to recognition than anything else. Like he's not surprised she's here. Like this meeting was scheduled long before either of them knew about it. Cage's performance in this scene is extraordinary for what it withholds as much as what it reveals. Longlegs says things, strange things, encoded things, things that don't resolve into clear meaning on first pass. But the way Cage delivers them strips out all the conventional signals about how to receive them. There's no menace in the delivery, no subterranean threat. There's something that reads as genuine, not warmth exactly, but sincerity. He means what he says. The problem is that what he says doesn't make sense in any framework Harker or the viewer currently has access to. Monroe's reaction to him is crucial. Harker doesn't perform fear in this scene, which in another film might read as the protagonist maintaining professional composure under pressure. Here it reads differently. She seems less afraid than confused in a specific way. Confused the way you're confused when someone says something in a language you're sure you don't know, but somehow partially understand. There's a flicker of something. Recognition again. That word that Monroe keeps just at the edge of expressible, visible only in the slight quality of attention she gives his words. The scene ends without resolution. No information extracted, no cipher cracked, no advantage established. Harker walks away with less clarity than she arrived with, and more questions than she knows what to do with. Carter's pragmatic expectation that direct contact with the suspect would yield something actionable is quietly defeated. What Harker has instead is a feeling, and in this film, feelings are the only reliable currency. The occult layer, taking the supernatural seriously. This is a good point to address what Longlegs does with its supernatural material, because this is where it diverges most sharply from the procedural tradition it superficially resembles, and where some viewers found themselves wrong-footed. The film takes its satanic imagery completely seriously, not metaphorically seriously. not in the way that smart horror often uses occult material as a vehicle for psychological or social commentary, where the supernatural represents something else: grief, repression, trauma, and the film maintains a degree of rationalist ambiguity about whether anything actually supernatural occurred. Longlegs presents it supernatural occurred. The devil, or something operating under that name within the film's cosmology, is a genuine force in this story. Longlegs is genuinely an instrument of something. The occult dimension isn't a metaphor for his delusion or a stylistic frame around a secular narrative. It's the actual engine of the plot. This is a genuinely bold choice, and it carries risk. Secular genre audiences, trained by decades of serial killer media in which the supernatural, if present at all, gets ultimately rationalizable, can experience this choice as a narrative betrayal, as the film refusing to explain itself in terms they can validate. The frustration you can hear in negative audience reviews of Longlegs very often comes down to this. I wanted a rational explanation, and the film refused to give me one. But consider what Perkins is actually doing by refusing. He is making a horror film that operates by horror's oldest and most fundamental logic, the logic of genuine dread, which is not the dread of a specific identifiable threat, but the dread of forces beyond human comprehension or control. The monster in Longlegs isn't a damaged human whose psychology can be mapped and therefore contained. It's a conduit for something that doesn't respond to profiling or evidence gathering or FBI procedural methodology. Taking the supernatural seriously means accepting that the terror in this film is theologically structured. It emerges from a worldview in which evil is a thing in itself, not a symptom or a byproduct. That's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. The discomfort is the film working correctly. Harker's visions, psychology, or prophecy interspersed through the second act are brief, jagged fragments, not quite flashbacks, not quite hallucinations, something in between. Harker experiences them at odd moments, falling asleep, losing focus during a particularly deep engagement with the case materials, or in the borderland between waking and dreaming that the film keeps returning to as a physical space. What she sees in these fragments is consistent with the film's visual language throughout: compressed, slightly distorted, winter-lit, but with an even more pronounced sense of unreality. Figures that don't hold their shape quite right, spaces that are familiar but wrong. A recurring sense of something watching from outside the frame of whatever she's seeing. The film is deliberately ambiguous about whether these visions are psychic access to past events, which Harker's established intuitive ability would make possible, or memories of something she actually experienced and has suppressed. This ambiguity is one of the more precisely calibrated tensions in the script. If they're psychic impressions, they're information she's receiving about others' trauma. If they're memories, they're information about her own. The two possibilities have radically different implications for who Harker is and how she relates to this case, and Perkins withholds resolution of that ambiguity until it can land with maximum force. Monroe plays these moments with a vulnerability that's different from her baseline flatness elsewhere, a crack in the composed exterior that suggests the visions access something she'd rather not access, a part of her that exists below the controlled, professional surface she presents to the world. It's carefully parceled out, just enough to make the viewer register that the armor is there and that there's something beneath it, without tipping the character into emotional expressiveness she hasn't earned yet. The question of what these visions actually are, information or memory, prophecy or trauma, is the thread that's going to pull the film structure apart in the third act and put it back together in a different shape. Everything in this middle section is quietly tightening around that question, drawing it toward the surface where it can't be avoided. The geography of fear, Oregon as setting. One thing worth appreciating separately is the film's use of its Pacific Northwest setting, not just as backdrop but as active contributor to its emotional register. Oregon in Longlegs is grey and cold and spacious in the particular way of landscapes that are beautiful and hostile simultaneously. The open country roads, the forested distances, the small towns that exist in isolation, separated from each other by stretches of nothing where anything could happen and no one would know about it for a while. The sky that doesn't so much darken at dusk as bleach to a different shade of grey. Production designer Danny Vermette and Arochi make choices that emphasize the region's quality of removal. the sense of being geographically distant from centers of institutional authority, from the urban environments where cultural and legal norms are most actively maintained. The families who've been killed don't live in visible communities. They live in single houses with too much space between them and their nearest neighbor. They live in the kind of isolation that evil historically favors, not because evil is more prevalent in rural spaces, but because it's more containable there, more able to complete itself before anyone notices. This geography is also emotionally congruent with Harker. She fits in these spaces the same way she fits in, or doesn't fit in, the FBI offices. She moves through the landscape with the same quiet disconnection she moves through institutional environments. Open country roads don't seem to unsettle her the way they might unsettle another character placed in this story. She belongs here in some way that the film keeps implying without stating. Another seed being planted quietly, patiently, in soil it won't be asked to germinate until we are further in. There's a moment in every great horror film where the ground shifts. Not a jump scare, not a revelation delivered through dialogue, but a structural lurch. A moment where the film's entire architecture reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity and what came before suddenly reads differently. The Sixth Sense has it. Hereditary has it. Longlegs has it too. And when it arrives with the quiet, devastating certainty of something that was always inevitable. The second half of Act 2 is the film building toward that moment. Everything here is convergence, threads pulling toward each other, the investigator and the investigated drawing into a proximity that was never accidental. By the end of this section of the film, Harker isn't hunting a stranger. She's hunting something that has known her name since before she could say it herself. The new crime scene, escalation. The act opens, effectively, with a fresh murder. A family has been killed. The pattern holds. The father, the home, the note, the doll. But something is different this time, and the film registers the difference through Harker's reaction before spelling it out through dialogue. The escalation is visible in the crime scene's texture. The previous murders, spread across decades, had a quality of patient execution, terrible in their outcomes, but carried out with a methodical quality that suggested Longlegs operated on his own timeline, at his own pace, according to a schedule that had nothing to do with external pressure. This latest killing feels hurried. There's a roughness to it, a slightly degraded quality of control, as if whatever mechanism Longlegs was serving demanded acceleration, and the acceleration introduced error. Harker reads this immediately. She walks the scene with a changed quality of attention, less analytical, more visceral, as if the crime scene is speaking to her in a register that bypasses her investigative training and lands somewhere more instinctive. Carter sees her reaction and doesn't ask about it. He's learned by now that asking about her process yields less information than simply watching where she goes. Where she goes is toward a specific detail in the note. Something in the language has shifted. A construction, a phrase, a formulation that sits differently from the earlier correspondence. It's small enough that most people wouldn't catch it, which is probably why Harker catching it feels significant. She's not just reading evidence. She's reading something that's being addressed to her specifically, and she's beginning to understand that. Ruth Harker, the mother problem. The film's decision to introduce Harker's mother at this point in the narrative is one of its most structurally interesting choices, and it's worth examining before we get to the revelations the character enables. Alicia Witt plays Ruth Harker, Lee's mother, and the performance is one of the film's great unheralded achievements. Ruth is deeply religious, specifically Christian in the fervent, personal, slightly isolated way that the film's specific Northwest setting makes entirely believable. She lives alone in a remote property. She communicates with Lee with a warmth that's real but slightly off frequency. The warmth of someone whose primary relationship is with God and whose relationships with other people exist in that shadow. She loves her daughter. She is also, the film makes gradually clear, extraordinarily frightened of something, and has been frightened of it for a very long time. Wit brings to Ruth a quality that could be described as contained panic. Someone who learned long ago to build structures around a terror that never fully resolved, who has maintained those structures so long that maintaining them is second nature, who can be entirely functional and apparently peaceful while something underneath continues to roar. It's a precise, difficult thing to do, and Wit does it so naturally that you don't immediately register the performance sophistication. She just seems like a slightly intense religious woman. Only on reflection does the full shape of what she is carrying become visible. The scenes between Monroe and Witt have an unusual quality. Two people who love each other, who share a history that's more complicated than either of them has fully mapped, operating in the specific discomfort of a relationship where important truths have been held back for so long that sharing them now feels almost impossible. The dynamic isn't estrangement exactly. It's more like two people in adjacent rooms of the same house who've both gotten very good at not opening the connecting door. When Lee visits Ruth, ostensibly for ordinary family reasons, but obviously tracking something the investigation has surfaced, the conversation has the quality of two parallel interrogations, each woman trying to find out what the other knows without revealing what she's looking for. Monroe and Witt play this with a restraint that makes the scene's subterranean tension all the more effective. What isn't said here is louder than what is, and the film trusts the audience to hear it. The revelation architecture. Here's where I want to be careful, because Longlegs structures its central revelations in a way that's genuinely unusual and deserves accurate description rather than simplification. The film doesn't have one single twist moment. It has a series of progressive disclosures that each recontextualize what came before, a structure more like peeling an onion than pulling a rug. Each layer reveals another layer. Each answer generates a more fundamental question, and the final shape of the truth, when you can see it whole, is stranger and more disturbing than the straightforward serial killer narrative the film's surface appeared to be telling. What emerges across the second half of Act 2 is this: Harker's connection to the case isn't professional, it's personal. It's so personal that the word connection is almost insufficient. She isn't connected to this case from outside it. She is part of it, has been from the beginning, was woven into it before she had any agency to resist. The how and why of that weaving involves the film's supernatural premise, the literal theological dimension we discussed earlier, and the progressive revelation of Harker's own history, including elements of her past that she doesn't fully remember and that Ruth has for reasons that are beginning to become clear, carefully obscured. Lee's intuitive ability isn't simply a professional asset, a natural gift that predisposed her toward FBI work. It has a source, a specific origin, something that was done or that happened rather than simply something she was born with. The film handles this revelation carefully, doling it out in fragments rather than delivering it in a single expository scene. This is the right call. A lesser film would find the moment where all the pieces click into place and deliver it through dialogue, a character explaining the backstory to another character for the audience's benefit. Perkins resists this. The understanding develops impressionistically, assembled by the viewer from fragments of scene, from the accumulating weight of detail, from Harker's own dawning comprehension arriving alongside ours. What Longlegs actually is. This is probably the most contentious element of the film's premise, and the one that divided audiences most sharply, so it's worth discussing with some care. Longlegs is not, or not only, a serial killer. He is not operating from criminal psychology in the conventional sense, from trauma, from pathology, from the distorted private logic of a damaged individual. He is, within the film's literal cosmological framework, an agent of the devil. Not metaphorically, not in the grandiose self-delusion sense that certain real-world criminals have used to justify their actions. Actually, the film means this. His method, the dolls, the possessed fathers, the birthday murders, is a form of soul collection. The families are being offered up. The fathers don't commit violence from their own volition. They are briefly occupied by something that uses them as instruments and discards them when the purpose is served. Longlegs identifies the families, prepares them through a mechanism the film implies involves his handmade dolls, and facilitates an arrangement that he understands as sacred service. What makes this genuinely chilling rather than merely weird is the film's insistence on Longlegs' sincerity. He is not a man who pretends to serve the devil as cover for desires he knows are simply criminal. He genuinely believes in and genuinely serves the thing he claims to serve. There's no subterranean psychology to excavate, no childhood wound to identify as the real explanation. The film forecloses that interpretive exit. You either accept the premise on its own terms or you're watching a different, lesser film than the one Perkins made. Cage's performance is built entirely on that sincerity. The reason Longlegs is so unnerving isn't his violence. He's not particularly violent on screen in the conventional horror sense. It's his commitment. He means every word. He experiences no doubt. He has arrived at a completely coherent inner world, however alien its premises, and inhabits it with a totality that most people never achieve for anything. The horror of true belief in terrible things is the horror Cage embodies, and he embodies it without flinching. The doll problem, craft as conduit. The film deepens its treatment of the handmade dolls across this section, and it's worth spending some time on what, specifically, they represent within the narrative. Longlegs makes them. This is established clearly. The dolls are his creations, products of real craft and real labor, objects he made with his hands over extended periods of time. They are large, roughly human sized, constructed from materials that include salvaged fabrics, found objects, and details that are disturbingly personal to the specific families they're delivered to. They aren't mass produced vessels. Each one is individual. Each one is made for its recipient. Within the film's logic, the dolls are the mechanism of transmission. They are how the influence that Longlegs serves enters the homes and gets into the fathers. They are placed in houses, found by families who presumably accept them or can't remove them, and they do something. The film is deliberately imprecise about the mechanism. We don't see the possession process in explicit detail, which is the right call. But the implication is that the dolls carry something, that they are conduits rather than simply objects, that the craft that went into them was itself a form of ritual preparation. What's interesting about this, and what the film doesn't underline as heavily as it might, is the implication about Longlegs' relationship to his own work. He makes beautiful things in the service of evil. The craftsmanship is genuine. There's care in the dolls, attention, something that in another context would be called love. The same capacity that might have made him an artist, the same focused devotion to physical craft, is here directed toward a monstrous purpose. This is a dimension of the character that rewards consideration, the tragedy of a talent completely captured by a terrible thing. Harker's breaking point. As the act closes, Harker reaches a moment of crisis, not dramatically performed, not exploded into an emotional confrontation, but arrived at quietly in the way this film does everything important. She has enough information to understand that something about her history intersects with the case in a way she can't dismiss. The visions are intensifying, arriving with more frequency and more detail. The cipher work is yielding connections she doesn't want to acknowledge. And Ruth, in their last conversation of the act, has said something, carefully, in her particular way of saying things that mean more than their surface content, that Harker can't unhear. Monroe plays this internal crisis through reduction rather than expression. As Harker gets closer to the truth, she gets quieter, stiller, more compressed in her physical presence. The characteristic flatness that has been a consistent quality throughout becomes something denser, not emptiness, but weight, the quality of someone carrying a realization they haven't yet allowed themselves to fully form. It's precise, difficult acting that refuses the emotional release a less committed performance would reach for, and it makes the eventual third act explosion of feeling, when it comes, genuinely earned rather than generically cathartic. The act ends at a threshold. We are standing with Harker at the edge of understanding, looking at a picture that's almost fully assembled, dreading the last piece because we can already see the shape it's going to make. There's a version of Longlegs that ends with Lee Harker catching the killer, closing the case, and returning to her life with whatever damage the investigation inflicted on her intact but survivable. That film would be competent. It would satisfy genre expectations. It would leave audiences with the procedural's traditional comfort, the comfort of institutional order reasserted, evil contained, the world restored to something navigable. Osgood Perkins isn't interested in that film. What he's interested in, what the entire preceding narrative has been building the architecture for, is a third act that destroys the procedural premise entirely and replaces it with something far more personal and far more devastating. By the time Longlegs reaches its final act, it isn't a serial killer thriller anymore. It's a film about inheritance, about what parents pass to children without consent, about the specific horror of discovering that the person who shaped your earliest understanding of the world made a bargain you're now required to honor. That's a different story. It's a harder story, and Perkins tells it without flinching. The truth about Lee Harker. The revelation that organizes the third act arrives not as a single dramatic disclosure, but as a final convergence of the fragments the film has been scattering since its first frame. And it's genuinely shocking, not in the cheap sense of a plot surprise that only surprises you before you immediately start looking for the holes in the logic, but in the deeper sense of a truth that recontextualizes everything and then keeps its coherence under examination. Lee Harker was one of the children Longlegs visited back in that 1974 cold open. The compressed frame, the snowy road, the figure that got out of the car. He wasn't there to harm her. He was there because her mother had made a deal. Ruth Harker, the gentle, frightened, deeply religious woman played by Alicia Witt with such careful, contained dread. The woman who loves her daughter genuinely and unconditionally. The woman who prays. She made a deal with the thing that works through Longlegs, gave over something, offered something, entered a covenant in exchange for something she wanted badly enough to accept terms she must have understood were terrible. What she wanted was a child. What she gave, what she didn't understand, she was giving, or understood and compartmentalized, or understood and spent 30 years trying to pray her way out of, was a claim on that child's future. Lee wasn't randomly assigned to the Longlegs case by the FBI's bureaucratic machinery. She was drawn to it. Her intuitive ability, the gift that made her so effective as an investigator, is itself a product of the covenant, a satanic inheritance, something placed in her at or before birth, a mark that made her simultaneously the instrument of Longlegs' capture and the mechanism of his ultimate purpose. The structure of this revelation is almost geometrically elegant. Everything that made Harker effective at catching Longlegs, her psychic access to the case's details, her ability to navigate its logic, her inexplicable connection to evidence that should have meant nothing to her, was engineered by the same force that Longlegs serves. She was built for this, not to stop the murders, to complete them. Monroe's third act, the controlled demolition. This is where Maika Monroe's work in the film achieves its full dimension, and I want to give it the space it deserves because it's one of the most undervalued performances in the 2024 horror landscape. The entire film, Monroe has played Harker's flatness as armor, as the outward expression of someone who learned early to keep the world at a controlled distance because proximity costs something she can't afford to keep paying. That flatness has also, it now becomes clear, been the outward expression of suppression, of memories deliberately obscured, of a history that was protected from her own access because knowing it would have changed the trajectory she was supposed to follow. When that armor cracks in the third act, Monroe doesn't abandon the character's essential quality. She doesn't suddenly become warm, emotionally available, conventionally expressive. She stays inside Harker, but inside a Harker whose containment system has been breached, whose suppressed material is surfacing without her being able to stop it. The result is something genuinely harrowing, a person experiencing a collapse that has been structurally inevitable for decades, finally arriving, unable to be forestalled any further. The scenes with wit in the third act are the film's emotional core. Ruth trying to explain the inexplicable, her love for Lee, not in question, her act not in question either, both true simultaneously, both needing to be held in the same moment. Wit plays this with a quiet, devastated dignity that refuses self-pity without pretending to equanimity. She knows what she did, she has always known. The religion that fills her home isn't comfort. It's the frantic attempt to negotiate something back from the other side of a deal she can't unmake. Monroe receives this information with a stillness that is its own kind of earthquake. The stillness of a person who has just had the floor removed from under them and hasn't yet started falling. The conversation between them is the best scene in the film. Not the most visually spectacular, not the most plot productive, the scene that most clearly shows what Longlegs, at its deepest level, is actually about. It's about being handed a legacy you didn't choose. It's about parents and what they bequeath. It's about the specific irreversible horror of loving someone who has done something that can't be forgiven and can't be undone and can't be escaped. It's personal in a way that only makes full sense when you remember whose son directed this film. The confrontation, Longlegs in his own space. The film builds toward a final confrontation with Longlegs that deliberately refuses the cathartic structure the genre promises. We find him in a domestic environment, his home, or what passes for one, a space that reflects his particular psychology with the unself-conscious completeness that only genuinely private spaces achieve. It's full of his craft, the workbenches where dolls are made, the materials, the accumulated evidence of decades of labor in service of a purpose that everyone in the conventional world would call evil and that he experiences as sacred. It's a deeply strange space, not theatrical, not designed to impress or threaten, not the villain's lair of genre convention. It's the workspace of someone who has been doing the same job for a very long time and doesn't particularly care whether anyone approves. Cage in this environment is different from Cage in the interview room, contained, even in some terrible way, peaceful. This is Longlegs at home, not performing, not navigating the alien territory of human institutional spaces, but existing in the context he built for himself, surrounded by the objects and purposes that constitute his actual life. The horror here is not of violence or madness, but of completion, a person who has achieved a total integration of self and purpose, however monstrous that purpose is. He is, in his own context, at rest. The confrontation that follows doesn't play out as a climactic chase or a fight. Physical action is almost beside the point here. The film has established from the beginning that what's at stake is not Harker's physical survival, but her soul's autonomy, and that's not a problem you solve with a gun. What matters in this final encounter is what Lee does with the knowledge she now carries about herself, about her mother, about the covenant she was born into without consent, about whether the thing she was built to serve will, in fact, be served. The ending. What actually happens? Here's where I need to be precise, because the film's ending is one of its most debated elements and deserves accurate treatment. Harker kills Longlegs. She shoots him. He dies. Or rather, the particular physical vessel that has housed him for these decades is destroyed. The case, in procedural terms, closes. No more murders, no more notes, no more notes, no more dolls. The thing is done. But the film doesn't end there. And it doesn't end there because ending there would be a lie. What happens in the final moments is quiet and terrible and earns every second of the dread the preceding 90 minutes built. The covenant isn't broken by Longlegs' death. The claim doesn't expire. The mark on Lee Harker, the inheritance from a bargain made before she existed, doesn't lift because the instrument of that bargain is gone. Something else will use her. Something already knows it will. The final image, and I won't describe it in complete granular detail for those who haven't seen it, though if you've come this far in a detailed film analysis, you've probably made your peace with spoilers, communicates this with a devastating economy. It's not a jump scare, it's not an action. It's a quality in Harker's face, a settled thing, something that wasn't there before, something that answers questions about her nature that she spent the whole film pursuing, and answers them in the worst possible way. Monroe carries this final image entirely. No dialogue, no dramatic score cue underlining the horror for you. Just a face that has arrived at a new understanding of itself and the specific quality of that understanding and the implications it carries for everything that comes next. It's a genuinely brave ending, not because it's bleak. Horror has plenty of bleak endings, but because it's honest about its own logic. The film established from the beginning that the supernatural premise was literal, that the forces at work here were real forces and not metaphors, that evil in this world operates according to its own terms and not the terms human institutions or human resolve can override. The ending honors that premise completely. To wrap things differently, to have Harker's determination break the covenant, to let the procedural victory translate into spiritual victory, would betray everything the film worked to build. Perkins refuses the betrayal. The ending is what the film earned, what the ending means for Harker's arc. Stepping back from the specific narrative events, the arc the film traces for Lee Harker is one of the more unusual protagonist journeys in recent genre cinema. She begins the film as someone whose exceptional ability sets her apart, whose disconnection from social normalcy reads as the price of being gifted rather than damaged. The investigation looks, from the outside, like an opportunity, the unconventional agent getting the career making case. By the end, the arc has inverted entirely. The gift was given, not grown. The disconnection isn't the price of ability, it's the symptom of what was done to her before she could resist. The case isn't an opportunity, it's a completion. She didn't catch Longlegs, she was guided to him, and the guidance had nothing to do with her career or her skills or her choices. That's an extraordinarily dark reading of a protagonist's journey. Harker doesn't achieve growth or agency in the conventional sense. She achieves knowledge, which is worse. She knows the truth of herself, and the truth is that the self she built, the competent, contained, professionally effective person who walked into that first scene, was erected over a foundation she didn't lay and cannot remove. But there's something else in the ending too, something that resists pure despair even in its bleakness. Harker knows. Whatever she's been made to be, she knows it now. The suppression is gone, the obscured history is clear, the covenant is visible. There's an argument, the film doesn't make it explicitly, but is present in the subtext, that knowledge, even terrible knowledge, is better than the managed ignorance Ruth spent decades maintaining. That being able to see the truth of your situation, however terrible, is a different kind of thing than being protected from it. Whether it's a better kind of thing is a question the film leaves genuinely open. That ambiguity is the final gift of a film that has been generous with its ambiguities throughout. Longlegs doesn't tell you how to feel about where it leaves Lee Harker. It puts you in her position, in possession of information that changes everything, uncertain what to do with it, suspended in the specific horror of complete understanding, and lets you sit there, which is exactly right. Everything we've discussed so far, the narrative architecture, the character work, the theological underpinning, exists in service of a feeling. And that feeling isn't delivered through story alone. It's delivered through the specific technical frame by frame choices that Osgood Perkins and his collaborators made about how to put images and sounds together. The craft of Longlegs is where its atmosphere lives, and atmosphere is ultimately what the film is selling. Get into this layer of the work, and what initially seems like mood becomes method, deliberate, sophisticated, entirely intentional. Andres Arochi and the visual grammar director of photography. Andres Arochi wasn't a household name in American cinema before Longlegs, and the film's success changed that in the way that one extraordinary piece of work can define a career trajectory almost overnight. What Arochi did here, what he and Perkins developed together, deserves serious examination because it's one of the most thoughtfully constructed visual glamours in recent horror filmmaking. The foundation of the film's look is a principle that sounds simple but is devilishly difficult to execute. Everything should be slightly wrong, not dramatically wrong, not obviously distorted, not stylized in a way that announces itself as stylization, just off enough that the viewer's visual cortex registers discomfort before their conscious mind can identify the source. The lens choices are central to this. Arochi used a combination of vintage anamorphic lenses, older glass that introduces subtle barrel distortion, particularly at the edges of the frame, and period appropriate optics that rendered faces and environments with a slightly soft, slightly unstable quality. Digital cinematography today tends toward exceptional sharpness and almost clinical precision that makes images feel present and concrete. Arochi's work on Longlegs deliberately moves away from that precision toward images that feel like they're being remembered rather than observed. There's a dreamlike softness to the focus, not the aggressive soft focus of classic Hollywood cinematography, but a gentle imprecision that makes the world of the film feel slightly unmoved from reality. The frame compositions operate on a principle of productive discomfort. Perkins and Arochi consistently place subjects off center in ways that violate the rule of thirds without quite landing in the kind of deliberate symmetry that Wes Anderson or Stanley Kubrick would use. The framing puts characters where they don't quite belong within the image, too far left or too low, or positioned relative to the negative space in ways that create a subtle compositional anxiety. You keep almost consciously wanting to reframe the shot, to put the subject somewhere that feels stable, and the film keeps refusing to do that. The discomfort accumulates imperceptibly across the runtime and contributes enormously to the film's ambient dread. The aspect ratio shift, compression as narrative tool, the choice to use different aspect ratios for different temporal registers in the film is one of the most elegant technical decisions in a film full of elegant technical decisions. Present day sequences, the FBI investigation, Harker's professional life, the contemporary narrative are shot in a standard widescreen ratio that gives the frame its familiar horizontal openness. Memory sequences, flashbacks, and the film's cold open occupy a narrower, more compressed format that literally reduces the image's width without reducing its height. The result is a frame that looks almost square by contemporary standards, closer to the boxy television ratio of the early 1990s that the flashback content is set in. The immediate practical effect is that past sequences feel smaller, more constrained, more enclosed than present sequences. The world contracts when we go back in time. The spaces feel tighter, more oppressive, less navigable, but the choice does something more sophisticated than period appropriate set dressing would achieve alone. It makes the past feel like the past in a physiological way, creates a distinct visual category for memory that the brain responds to before any conscious interpretation occurs. It also does something almost symbolic. The compressed past is the thing that's been suppressed, kept small, kept contained, prevented from expanding into the present's full width. When present and past begin to contaminate each other as the film progresses, when the boundaries between Harker's current investigation and her own buried history start to blur, the aspect ratio choice makes that contamination visually legible. The compressed image of memory is trying to expand. The present's full width frame is being encroached upon by the narrow frame of what was hidden. Whether audiences consciously process this is almost beside the point. The unconscious processing is what matters, and the unconscious processing works. Color palette, warmth as absence, Longlegs is a cold film visually. That's not a casual observation. It's a precise description of how Arochi graded the footage in post-production, desaturating the image in specific, selective ways that remove warmth without creating the steel blue coolness of many contemporary crime thrillers. The color palette is more accurately described as bleached. Colors are present. This isn't a black and white film or a film using the cold monochromatism of something like The Road, but they've had their warmth drained, leaving colors that exist but don't comfort. The greens of Oregon's forests are muted and grey tinged. The interiors of homes, places that, in the vocabulary of domestic space, should register warmth and safety, are lit and graded to feel institutional, flat, slightly clinical. Only the dolls, with their fabrics and textures, occasionally carry genuine warmth in their color, which is one of the more disturbing visual ironies in the film. The most warmly rendered objects are the most sinister ones. Longlegs himself is the extreme expression of this palette. His skin has been processed in makeup and posed toward a translucency that sits at the absolute cold end of the spectrum. Not grey, not green tinged, but genuinely lacking in the warm tones that human skin normally carries. He looks like light would pass through him if he were just slightly more of what he already is. Against the film's already cold backgrounds, he reads as an absence, a human-shaped area where warmth doesn't exist. The rare moments when warmth does enter the frame, candlelight in Ruth's home, certain moments of winter sun, are used with careful precision. Warmth in Longlegs is never straightforwardly comforting. It's either the warmth of dangerous religious fervor or the warmth of memory that has been distorted by suppression, or the warmth of something that's about to be violated. The film trains you, gradually, to experience warm-toned images with suspicion rather than comfort. That's a sophisticated piece of visual rhetoric. Camera movement, stillness as unease. Where many horror films use aggressive camera movement to generate tension. The handheld pursuit shot, the unmotivated push-in on a threatening space. Longlegs does almost the opposite. The camera is largely, almost stubbornly, still. Static compositions hold longer than comfort typically allows. The camera watches scenes without the anxious repositioning that most contemporary filmmaking employs. The constant micro-adjustments that communicate a kind of nervous energy and implicitly reassure the viewer that the camera is engaged, responsive, alert. Arochi's camera is patient in a way that unnerves rather than reassures. It watches the way something watches when it has nowhere to be and all the time in the world, when it isn't waiting for anything in particular because it already knows how things are going to unfold. When the camera does move, the movement is slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. There are no quick pans or rapid repositionings. Movements tend to be long, steady, unhurried glides that arrive at their destination without any sense of urgency. This quality of unhurried movement is itself disturbing in a horror film context, where we are conditioned to expect movement to correlate with threat, fast movement for fast threat, stillness for nothing. There yet, Longlegs uses slow, patient movement for its most unsettling moments, creating a disjunction between the pace of the camera's behavior and the emotional temperature of what it's showing. The one significant exception to this stillness is worth noting during Harker's vision sequences. The fragmented, half remembered, half received impressions that punctuate the film. The camera becomes genuinely unstable, handheld, and jolting, the image breaking apart at the edges. The contrast with the film's baseline stillness makes these sequences feel genuinely invasive, genuinely alien to the world the film has established. The camera's loss of control in those moments is the visual equivalent of the information Harker is receiving, something breaking through from outside the contained, still world she inhabits. Sound design, discomfort as architecture. If the cinematography of Longlegs operates through subtlety and accumulation, the sound design is where the film allows itself to be somewhat more aggressive, though even here, the aggression is disciplined rather than gratuitous. The score was composed by Zilgi, and it functions less as conventional film music and more as part of the ambient sound environment, bleeding in and out of the film's background soundscape in ways that don't always announce themselves as score. This is deliberate. The goal was a sonic world where the distinction between score and sound design is deliberately blurred, where the line between the diegetic sounds of the world, wind, creak of floorboards, breath, and the musical manipulation of those sounds is never quite stable. The effect is pervasive, unease rather than localized scale. You can't reliably identify when the film's emotional manipulation is coming from the story itself and when it's coming from the sound design, which means you can't bracket the score the way you can in a film with clean separation between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. The discomfort feels more ambient, more environmental, more like something in the air of the story's world rather than something being played at you from outside it. Low frequency sound design is deployed throughout with careful intention. There are sustained tones, just at the edge of audible perception, below the threshold at which most people would identify them as musical, that run through certain sequences like a slow current. The physiological effect of sustained low frequency sound is well documented. It triggers a stress response in the nervous system, creates a sense of unease or threat that the conscious mind can't locate or account for. Using this technically in a theater is essentially playing the audience's nervous systems directly, bypassing narrative comprehension and creating dread at a biological level. Ethical? Debatable. Effective? Absolutely. The use of silence, as important as what Longlegs sounds like, is what it doesn't sound like. The film uses silence with the precision of a weapon. Most contemporary horror films are afraid of silence. They fill the gaps between scare sequences with ambient score, with the constant low hum of background sound design, with anything that keeps the audio environment active and signals to the audience that engagement is ongoing. Longlegs isn't afraid. There are moments, extended moments, where the soundtrack simply stops, not fade to quiet but genuine, unambiguous silence. The kind that in a theater setting becomes physically noticeable, because theaters are never genuinely silent, and any sound they carry suddenly becomes more audible. These silence beats arrive at specific junctures, after revelations, after the film has shown you something disturbing, at the end of conversations where important things have been left unsaid. They function as the auditory equivalent of white space on a page, room for the viewer to process, to feel the weight of what just happened, to sit in the discomfort rather than being moved immediately into the next stimulus. Silence in horror is confidence. It says, what just happened is enough. I don't need to underline it. I'm willing to let it sit and work on you without assistance. That confidence is part of what makes Longlegs feel like the work of a director operating at full creative authority rather than a filmmaker making concessions to genre convention. The Longlegs voice, Sound as identity. Nicolas Cage's voice performance for Longlegs deserves separate treatment as a piece of sound design because it functions as much as a crafted sonic object as it does as a performance choice. The voice sits in an unusual register, high without quite being falsetto, soft without quite being gentle, with a slightly nasal quality that places it oddly in the head. It moves without warning into different registers, dropping suddenly into something gravelly and resonant that feels like a different instrument than the higher tones, then climbing back up with no apparent transition. It's not consistent in the way human voices are usually consistent. It sounds assembled rather than grown. Cage developed this voice through extended preparation, working with the character's physicality and vocal qualities over a long period before filming, finding something that felt genuinely alien rather than performatively strange. The difference is important. A performatively strange voice is one you can hear the actor constructing. You are aware of the choice, of the deliberateness, of the distance between the performer and the character's vocal expression. Cage's Longlegs voice lands differently. By the time you are deep into the film, it doesn't sound like a choice anymore. It sounds like the way that particular arrangement of matter, that specific physical body housing, that specific presence would sound when it speaks. In the theatre, Cage's voice for Longlegs is apparently even more effective than through home viewing systems because the specific frequency relationships between its different registers interact with theatrical audio in particular ways. It's a sound designed for large speaker systems, and in that environment, the disorienting quality of the voice becomes fully three dimensional. Film analysis has a tendency to treat performance as secondary to direction, as the material that a filmmaker shapes, rather than a creative force that shapes the film in return. Longlegs makes that hierarchy impossible to maintain. What Nicolas Cage and Maika Monroe do in this film isn't decoration on top of Perkins's vision. It is the vision, substantially, the film's atmosphere, its emotional register, its ability to sustain dread across a 101-minute runtime. All of it depends on two performances that are doing extraordinarily unusual things in front of the camera and doing them with a precision that only becomes fully visible on close examination. Nicolas Cage, the career context. To understand what Cage's Longlegs performance means, you have to understand where it sits in his trajectory. And that trajectory is one of the more genuinely interesting stories in contemporary American acting. In the 2000s and early 2010s, Cage became something like a meme, a repository for the internet's appetite for spectacular excess, a source of clips of apparently unhinged behavior that circulated with the ironic appreciation reserved for things that have crossed the threshold from bad to so bad. It's good. The Wicker Man remake, Ghost Rider, Season of the Witch. The reputation accumulated, and the reputation was not always unfair. There were genuine misfires, genuine performances calibrated at the wrong frequency for the films that surrounded them. But the critical reassessment, when it arrived, was forceful. Mandy in 2018 reframed Cage's intensity as a feature rather than a bug, as something that worked when placed in a film genuinely designed for it. Pig in 2021 did something even more significant. It demonstrated that beneath the full throttle mode that had become the meme-ified version of Cage was an actor capable of restraint and genuine interiority, capable of devastating subtlety when the role called for it. The critical conversation shifted. The question stopped being what happened to Nicolas Cage and started being what was the critical establishment missing about Nicolas Cage all along? Longlegs is the culmination of that reassessment, though it approaches from the opposite direction from Pig. Where Pig showcased restraint, Longlegs is full throttle, but full throttle controlled, full throttle in service of something rather than in spite of everything around it. Cage and Perkins found the precise creative context in which Cage's particular gift, his willingness to fully commit to extreme choices, to inhabit rather than represent, to abandon the self-protective irony that most actors maintain, serves the film completely rather than overwhelming it. What Cage actually does. Let's get specific because the brilliance of the Longlegs performance is in the details. The physical construction of the character begins with the prosthetic and makeup work, a significant facial transformation that changes Cage's proportions in subtle, deliberate ways. The nose is broader, the cheekbones sit differently, The skin tone is the one we discussed: translucent, warmth absent. But here's what's interesting about the makeup: it doesn't make Cage unrecognizable. You know it's him. The transformation is calibrated to be just substantial enough to make you slightly uncertain about what you're looking at without completely obscuring who it is. That uncertainty, the known made slightly unfamiliar, is itself unsettling in a specific way that complete disguise wouldn't achieve. The physicality that Cage built for Longlegs extends beyond the prosthetics. The way he holds his body has a strange stillness, punctuated by sudden, fluid movements that don't follow the rhythmic logic of normal human locomotion. Most people move in anticipation of where they're going. There's a lean, a preparation, a microsequence of weight shifting that precedes direction changes. Cage's Longlegs moves without that preparation. He simply is somewhere and then he's somewhere else, with the transition compressed in a way that reads as subtly wrong to observing eyes trained on normal human movement. The hands deserve particular attention. Longlegs' hands are extraordinarily expressive in the film, not in a theatrical, gesture heavy way, but in the quiet way of hands that have done a great deal of careful, precise work, that are accustomed to creating things and have a specific relationship to their own dexterity. The scenes where Longlegs handles objects carry an intimacy in the hands that's different from the rest of the physical performance, a tenderness almost. These are the hands that made the dolls. That's visible in how Cage uses them. The performance's emotional logic. Here's the key to understanding what Cage is doing and why it works so specifically in this film. Longlegs is never performing for anyone within the world of the film. Most screen villains perform. They perform menace, or intelligence, or control, or madness. They communicate to other characters and through other characters to the audience what they want to be understood as. There's an audience awareness to villain performance that's so common in the genre, it's practically structural. Hannibal Lecter performs. Anton Chigurh performs. Even the more grounded, realistic serial killer portrayals tend to include moments where the character's self-presentation carries an awareness of external perception. Cage's Longlegs doesn't perform, he simply exists within his own framework, and other characters, including Harker, including the investigators, including the audience, are irrelevant to that existence in a fundamental way. He is not trying to terrify Harker in the interview room. He is not trying to demonstrate intelligence or superiority or control. He is not working to maintain a particular image. He is just there, present in his own skin and his own cosmology, engaging with what's in front of him according to his own internal logic rather than any social feedback loop. That quality of non-performance is what makes the character genuinely unsettling rather than merely theatrical. Theatrical villains are frightening because of what they might do to you. Longlegs is frightening because he genuinely doesn't care about your framework for evaluating him, because your responses, your fear, your attempts to understand him through conventional categories are simply irrelevant to his actual purposes. The indifference is the horror, not malice, not sadism, not the desire to harm or control, just an orientation towards something entirely outside the human relational world in which your existence registers only insofar as it intersects with his service. Maika Monroe, The Harder Job. It's possible, common even, in reviews and online discussion of Longlegs to focus on Cage's performance as the film's central achievement and treat Monroe's work as effective but secondary. That reading is wrong, and I want to explain precisely why. Monroe's job in this film is harder than Cage's, not more impressive in the sense of more externally spectacular. Cage's performance is obviously, visibly extraordinary, while Monroe's is doing something that requires close attention to fully appreciate, but harder in the sense of more technically demanding, more precisely calibrated, more likely to fail in ways that would collapse the entire film. Cage's character is defined by excess, by strangeness, by the quality of being visibly unlike anything normal. Longlegs is a creation, and the creation can be seen and evaluated as a creation. Monroe is doing the opposite, playing a character who appears, on the surface, to be a fairly familiar archetype, the gifted but difficult detective, the emotionally closed investigator, while layering underneath that surface an entire hidden architecture of suppression, inheritance, and occult marking that the surface must simultaneously hide and imply. The work is almost entirely subterranean, and subterranean work, by definition, is easy to miss. The genius of Monroe's performance is that it has two completely different readings that are both fully supported by the same choices. Watched without knowledge of the film's revelations on a first viewing, before the third act reorganizes everything, Harker reads as a talented, unusual, emotionally disconnected professional whose flatness is simply the price of her gift. Watched with that knowledge, on a rewatch, or even on a first viewing by someone paying close enough attention, exactly the same moments read as suppression, as the managed surface of someone holding down a vast and terrible truth about themselves that they don't yet consciously possess. That double readability is almost impossible to achieve through conscious craft. You can plan for it intellectually, but executing it requires an actor who understands the character at a level that precedes technique, who can deliver choices that work simultaneously on two registers without either reading forcing the other out. Monroe does this throughout. Every flat reaction lands as both this person is emotionally contained and this person is protecting themselves from something they can't yet access. Same moment, same performance, two completely true meanings. The Monroe Witt dynamic Alicia Witt's Ruth provides Monroe's most valuable foil, and the two performers develop a dynamic across their scenes that deepens with each new piece of information the narrative delivers. What's remarkable about the scenes between them is the film's willingness to let the relationship be fully, genuinely loving, even as it's revealed to be built over betrayal. This isn't a film that simplifies Ruth into a villain parent whose love was never real. Her love for Lee is completely real, and Wit makes sure you feel that. The care she brings to Ruth's religious routines, the specific quality of warmth she brings to physical contact with her daughter, the way her voice changes when she speaks Lee's name. These are the marks of a woman whose central attachment is to her child, whose every fear is organized around the possibility of losing her, which makes what she did, the covenant, the bargain, the transaction that put Lee in the path of everything the film depicts, all the more devastating rather than less. She didn't do it from indifference or selfishness in any simple sense. She did it from the most powerful human motivation. She wanted a child. She wanted Lee specifically, wanted her into existence with a force that overrode everything she knew about the terms. And then she spent 30 years in prayer and terror trying to undo it or protect Lee from it or simply delay the accounting she knew was coming. Monroe and Witt play the scene where this is fully confronted with the understanding that certain performances can only come from actors who trust each other and trust the material. There's no defensive technique visible here, no self protective irony, no performance of emotion as distinct from experiencing it. They're both fully present, fully in the scene's devastation, and the result is one of those rare film moments where the craft becomes invisible and what remains is simply human truth. Supporting performances and the ensemble Blair Underwood's Carter has been discussed in the story analysis sections, but it's worth returning to him here from a purely performance standpoint. Underwood brings something to the role that elevates it beyond its functional narrative purpose, a quality of earned tiredness that makes Carter feel like a person who has existed for the entire duration of this case, not just the portion we are watching. The exhaustion isn't played for sympathy. It's simply there, the texture of someone who has been working something impossible for longer than they expected and has maintained their professionalism past the point where professionalism is comfortable. The smaller supporting roles, the FBI colleagues, the law enforcement figures who populate the procedural sequences are cast and performed with attention to the specific quality of discomfort they generate around Harker. These aren't backdrop figures. They are functionally part of the film's argument about Harker's essential apartness, and each of them contributes something small but precise to that argument. The collective effect is a world that's recognizably institutional and professional while consistently registering our protagonist as not quite belonging. Lauren Akala as Young Lee in the cold open deserves mention specifically, a child performance that accomplishes something extremely difficult. The Young Lee must register something, some quality of recognition or resonance in her encounter with Longlegs that plants the film's central mystery without explaining it, that shows us something is happening without telling us what. Akala does this with a stillness that mirrors Monroe's adult performance in ways that speak to Perkins's direction. the same quality of inward attention, the same absence of demonstrative reaction, the suggestion of understanding operating below the level the character can articulate. The continuity between child and adult performance is one of the film's quiet achievements. We walk through the narrative architecture, the craft decisions, the performances. Now comes the part that rewards all that accumulated attention. The layer beneath the layer, the place where Longlegs stops being a horror film about a serial killer and reveals itself as something considerably more searching and personal. Because Osgood Perkins didn't make this film to scare you, exactly. He made it to say something, and what he's saying is complicated enough that it took a 101-minute film built like a cathedral to say it properly. Inheritance as horror. The film's central theme, the one that everything else orbits, is inheritance, not in the estate and legacy sense, in the bone deep, inescapable, wasn't ours sense, the things our parents pass to us without our consent, that shape us before we have any capacity to resist shaping, that constitute the foundation of our identities, whether we know they're there or not. Lee Harker didn't choose her gift. She didn't choose the covenant. She didn't choose the mark that made her the instrument of forces she spent her entire adult life believing she was working against. Everything that defines her, her ability, her disconnection, her strange fit with the world, was determined before she existed as a decision making person. The horror of her situation isn't that evil found her, it's that evil made her, in the same transaction that made her at all. This is, in the most literal possible reading, a story about the sins of the mother visited upon the child. Ruth's transgression, the bargain, the covenant, isn't Ruth's to contain. It passed to Lee with the same biological inevitability as her eye color or her height. The supernatural dimension is almost beside the point here. The structure of the horror is recognizable from the most secular psychological framework available. Parents transmit things, not always what they intend. Sometimes the most loving parents transmit the most damaging inheritances, precisely because love doesn't prevent damage and sometimes enables it. Perkins has spoken in interviews with a careful obliqueness about how this theme connects to his own experience of growing up with Anthony Perkins as a father, of inheriting a particular relationship to horror and to public perception and to the specific weight of a famous parent's most famous role. He doesn't map the film onto his biography in any obvious way, and it would be reductive to try, but the emotional architecture of Longlegs, a child discovering that something was done before they could object, that has shaped everything about who they became, carries the weight of lived understanding, not just intellectual construction. The failure of rational institutions. The second major thematic thread running through Longlegs is something that connects to a much broader cultural anxiety, the inadequacy of rational empirical institutions. In this case, the FBI, law enforcement, the procedural machinery of justice, when confronted with forces that don't operate within their frameworks. This is a horror theme with a long tradition. The genre has always found productive territory in the gap between what official institutions claim they can handle and what actually exists in the world. What Longlegs does with this tradition is more specific and more pointed than simple science can't explain the supernatural genre business. It's asking a harder question. What happens when the very tools you've developed to understand evil are not just inadequate but actively misleading? When the framework of rational investigation doesn't just fail to capture the truth but actively obscures it? The FBI in this film is never corrupt, never incompetent, never the obstacle in the story. The way institutional antagonists often function in thrillers, they're trying. Carter is genuinely committed, genuinely skilled, genuinely working the problem with everything he has. The failure isn't personal, it's structural. The entire apparatus of modern law enforcement, its epistemological foundations, its methodologies, its conceptual categories, was built to address human criminal behavior. It doesn't have a methodology for what Longlegs is because it doesn't have a category for what Longlegs is because the category requires accepting premises that the institutional framework was explicitly designed to exclude. There's something genuinely disturbing about this argument and something that resonates beyond horror genre conventions. We live in a world where rational empirical frameworks are, rightly, the dominant tools for understanding most of what happens. but those frameworks carry within them an implicit exclusion of the category of genuine evil, evil as a thing in itself, rather than a symptom of identifiable causes. Longlegs asks what happens if that exclusion is a mistake. It's an uncomfortable question, and the film has the conviction to sit in the discomfort rather than resolving it. Religion, faith, and the weaponized sacred Ruth Harker is a deeply religious woman, and the film treats her religion with more complexity than horror usually manages when it uses Christianity as backdrop material. She is not the hypocritical church lady of satirical horror. She is not deluded or using faith as cover for something secular. Her belief is genuine, her prayer life sincere, her relationship with God as she understands it, the central organizing principle of her existence, and it didn't help. That's the film's most theologically charged statement. Ruth prayed for 30 years. She prayed for protection for Lee, for release from the covenant, for some divine mechanism that would void the arrangement she'd entered. She prayed with the whole force of sincere faith, the kind that doesn't hedge its bets or perform for social audiences. Nothing came. The covenant held. The thing she gave over wasn't returned. Her faith, real, costly, consistent, was simply insufficient against the force she'd set in motion. This isn't an anti-religion argument exactly. The film doesn't treat Ruth's faith as foolish or her prayers as self-deception. It treats them as genuine and genuinely insufficient, which is a more interesting and more disturbing position. The implication isn't that God doesn't exist. The film's literal satanic premise implies the opposite, but that the specific transaction Ruth entered wasn't one that conventional faith mechanisms could reverse. She made a deal with something that doesn't respect retroactive renegotiation, and prayer, for all its sincerity, couldn't override the contract law of whatever domain that bargain was registered in. Horror has historically been much more comfortable with satanic premises than with genuinely theological complexity, because genuine theological complexity requires taking both sides of the equation, divine and diabolical, seriously. Longlegs takes both seriously, and the result is a film whose religious dimension has actual weight rather than serving as occult window dressing. What Longlegs owes to Silence of the Lambs, and where it departs. The marketing comparison to The Silence of the Lambs was commercially effective and thematically illuminating, and also, in important ways, misleading enough to shape audience expectations in directions the film couldn't satisfy. The similarities are real: female FBI agent, male monster in custody, face-to-face encounters, the investigator bringing her own psychology to the encounter with the investigated, the investigation revealing as much about the investigator as about the killer. The performances at either pole, Monroe and Cage operating at different registers, the way Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins operated at different registers, carrying the film's central tension between them, but the differences are as important as the similarities, and they are structural rather than superficial. The Silence of the Lambs is fundamentally an optimistic film. Clarice wins. The monster is contained. The institutional machinery, represented by the FBI, is ultimately effective. It produces an agent capable of solving the problem, even if the problem nearly destroys her in the solving. The film's darkness is real, but it exists within a framework that confirms the value of intelligence, preparation, and professional commitment brought to bear on evil. Longlegs refuses that framework from the beginning. The institutional machinery is irrelevant. Harker's intelligence and preparation are instruments of the very force she thinks she's opposing. The investigation succeeds in the narrowest procedural sense while failing completely in every sense that matters. And the ending, rather than confirming that good people working hard can contain evil, suggests that evil has its own completion schedule and has always been on track to meet it. Jonathan Demme's film leaves you shaken but intact. Perkins's film leaves you shaken and wondering whether intact is even the right state to aim for. That's a meaningful difference in what these films ultimately argue about the world. The polarized audience response, understanding the divide. The 86% critic score versus the 60% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes is a data point that deserves genuine examination rather than dismissal. The people who were disappointed by Longlegs weren't wrong to be disappointed. They were disappointed because the film they were promised by the marketing was a different film from the one they received. The marketing sold a procedural thriller with an eccentric villain and a strong female lead. It promised puzzle solving satisfaction, the intellectual pleasure of a mystery assembled and solved, the cathartic comfort of evil identified and contained. It sold essentially a spiritual air to Silence of the Lambs. The film delivered atmospheric dread, a protagonist whose arc ends in inherited doom rather than professional triumph, a supernatural premise taken with theological seriousness, and an ending that deliberately withholds resolution. These are genuinely excellent things. They're what make Longlegs a significant piece of filmmaking rather than a successful genre exercise. But they're not what the marketing promised. And the gap between expectation and reality is real, even when the delivered film is better than the promised one. What's interesting about the discourse around Longlegs is how sharply it mirrors the discourse around other significant horror films that prioritized atmosphere over convention. Hereditary, Midsommar, The Witch, Suspiria in its various iterations. Each of those films generated a version of the same debate. Is this actually horror? Does it work? Is the slowness intentional or a failure of craft? Is the refusal of conventional resolution brave or pretentious? These debates are healthy. They are the sign of films that actually mean something, that have a distinct point of view rather than simply executing familiar genre mechanics competently. The films that everyone agrees about are usually the ones that haven't committed to anything, that play genre conventions safely enough to satisfy without challenging. Longlegs committed, fully in every department. That commitment produces both the passionate devotion of its admirers and the frustrated dismissal of its detractors, and both responses are, in their way, tributes to the film's seriousness. The neon factor, a new power in independent horror Longlegs, didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a specific moment in the independent film distribution landscape, with a specific distributor whose ambitions shaped how the film was positioned and how far it reached. Neon has been building something. Founded in 2017, the company made its early reputation on smart acquisitions and attention, getting campaigns Tonya, Parasite, which they distributed in the US and which won Best Picture in 2020, Titan, Bottoms. The Parasite campaign established that Neon was willing to spend marketing money in ways that matched the ambition of the films they were distributing, and the industry took notice. With Longlegs, Neon went all in on a bet that an unconventional horror film could break out of the specialty market entirely and reach mainstream audiences if positioned correctly. The 22.6 million opening weekend, a record for the distributor, validated the bet. The final 128 million worldwide validated it even more emphatically. Horror has always been commercially reliable, but indie horror, horror without the studio infrastructure, without the franchise recognition, without the IP safety net, has historically struggled to reach the scale Longlegs achieved. What Neon proved with this campaign is that the gap between art horror and commercial horror isn't as wide as the industry assumed, provided you're willing to find the specific audience that bridges both categories and design your campaign around them. Horror fans who want something genuinely disquieting rather than just frightening exist in significant numbers. They're voracious consumers of content, highly engaged with online discourse, willing to show up on opening weekend for something that seems like it might be worth their serious attention. Neon found them and brought them in. Perkins, after Longlegs. What this film changes for Osgood Perkins, Longlegs represents a fundamental shift in professional standing. He made the same films before this one, with the same level of craft and commitment, and they reached thousands of viewers. Longlegs reached millions. The question of what that scale changes for a director who has spent his career operating on the margins of commercial viability is a genuinely interesting one. The early answer seems to be it changes what he can access rather than what he wants to make. His projects in development following Longlegs have been reported as maintaining the atmospheric, personal, formally ambitious approach of his prior work. He is not pivoting towards studio franchise filmmaking, but the budget ceiling has presumably moved, the cast access has improved, the promotional machinery available to him has grown. He can make the same kind of films with more resources, and more resources in the service of vision, not instead of vision, is simply more capability. There's also the question of what Longlegs does for the broader cultural conversation about what horror is allowed to be. Every time a film with genuine formal ambition succeeds commercially in this genre, it creates permission for other filmmakers, for distributors willing to fund unconventional work, for the mainstream critical establishment that still sometimes struggles to take horror seriously as an art form. Longlegs is another data point in the ongoing argument that horror can be formally sophisticated, thematically serious, resistant to genre convention, and commercially viable simultaneously, not despite those qualities, because of them. The final question, does it work? I have been circling this question throughout this analysis and it deserves a direct answer at the end. Yes, Longlegs works, not perfectly. The mid-second act pacing tests patience in ways that might be slightly better managed, and certain expository moments are handled less elegantly than the film's best scenes. But as an achievement of atmosphere, of sustained dread, of formally ambitious horror filmmaking, that refuses the comfort of clean genre resolution. It works completely. It works because Perkins understood his own film well enough to trust it. He trusted the supernatural premise enough to take it literally rather than metaphorically hedging it. He trusted his performers enough to let them do difficult, subtle, sometimes baffling things without managing them toward more legible choices. He trusted his cinematographer, his production designer, his sound designers enough to let the craft carry weight that lesser directors hand to dialogue. He trusted his audience enough to refuse easy explanation, to let the ending land without a safety net of interpretive guidance. Trust is the rarest quality in commercial filmmaking, where every decision is subject to institutional pressure toward the legible and the safe. That Perkins maintained it across an entire production that ended up reaching a mass audience is remarkable. That the film rewards the trust, that it doesn't turn out to be obscure for obscurity's sake or difficult out of pretension, but genuinely, meaningfully strange in ways that pay off for the viewer willing to meet it on its own terms, is the thing that separates Longlegs from films that look similar from the outside but have less going on inside. Osgood Perkins made a film about what parents pass to children without permission. He made it with the son of Anthony Perkins's unflinching honesty and the particular access to inherited dread that comes from having lived next to one of horror's defining legacies. He made it with collaborators who understood his vision and executed it without compromise. He gave it to Nicolas Cage, who gave it everything he had, and to Maika Monroe, who gave it something harder to name than everything but just as complete. The result is a film that crawls under your skin and stays there, not because it assaults you with images of violence or delivers calculated jump scares at measured intervals, but because it tells a truth about inherited darkness, about the limits of rational institutions before genuine evil, about what it costs to know the truth of yourself, that the most honest part of you recognizes and can't dismiss. That's what great horror does. It finds the thing you already half knew was true and makes you look at it directly. Longlegs looks directly, every frame, every sound, every performance, and it doesn't look away.